Welcome to Sherwood Forest, Nottinghamshire, England. A fairly fitting location to begin today's video, don't you think? One of the main things I like to do on this channel is examine the real history behind the legend of Robin Hood and the individual histories of the real men who inspired the various fictional versions of the Robin Hood character from the stories throughout the centuries. Take me, for example, your lad Robert Hood of Wakefield. I was a real person. I actually did exist. I was a 14th century yeoman forester living in Wakefield with my lass Matilda, and my exploits helped to inspire the early Robin Hood ballads. But we're not talking about the real Robin Hoods today. No, we're not talking about me today, or any of the other lads for that matter. Today we're focusing solely on those fictional versions of the Robin Hood character from the stories throughout the centuries. Because you see, most people just assume that there's the one narrative when it comes to the Robin Hood stories. That of a disinherited nobleman, Ser Robin of Loxley, who was loyal to King Richard the Lionheart and fought in his crusades, to later return to England to fight the villainous Prince John, living in Sherwood Forest as an outlaw, robbing from the rich and giving to poor. But this is actually the narrative of the later and the more modern Robin Hood stories. And the Robin Hood character from those stories, the one that's come to be known and loved all across the modern world, is actually not the same Robin Hood character that we get in the original stories. One of the biggest differences between the early and the later Robin Hood stories relates to possibly the most well-known aspect of the legend in the modern world: robbing from rich to give to poor. Because you see, the original versions of Robin Hood and his merry band of lads did not rob the rich to give to the poor. Now don't get me wrong, they most certainly did rob people, mostly corrupt members of the church. But the robbing from the rich to give to the poor aspect of the legend didn't find its way into the stories until a little bit later on. And then of course, another big difference we have, the location. While the later and a lot of the more modern versions of the Robin Hood stories are synonymous with Sherwood Forest and Nottinghamshire, the original stories were mostly set in and around Barnsdale Forest in Yorkshire, with only one of the early ballads mentioning Sherwood Forest. And that brings us to another big difference. Now here I'm talking about the absence of two characters from the original Robin Hood stories. Now these two are very well known characters, very well associated with the Robin Hood legend. I am of course talking about Maid Marian and Friar Tuck, who do not appear in any of the original Robin Hood ballads. Like the nobleman Robin Hood character, they are both products of the later Robin Hood stories. And there are some key differences between the actual Robin Hood characters themselves. For example, the early Robin Hood character was not an Anglo-Saxon nobleman. Him and his lads were yeomen of the forest. And the early Robin Hood wasn't a crusader fighting for Richard the Lionheart. In fact, it's actually the later and more modern Robin Hood stories that are set during the reign of the Lionheart and his brother Prince John. The early ballads, or at least one that we know of for sure, were set during the reign of King Edward. The later and more modern versions of the Robin Hood character were a damn sight more noble and honourable than the early versions. The early Robin Hood was the furthest thing from a knight in shining armour. Now we've got some versions of the later Robin Hood who, almost like a medieval style Batman, will vow against killing and instruct his merry men to do the same. Whereas earlier versions of Robin Hood and his merry band of lads would kill without hesitation. I'm talking straight up decapitate monks. These lads were some vicious thugs, quite unlike the gallant self-sacrificing heroes that are synonymous with the legend in the modern world. And one of the reasons for the changes in the themes of these stories throughout the centuries is a reflection of the actual audiences of which the stories are being developed for. Now, the early ballads would have originated from spoken word, being told by bards in taverns and alehouses for the enjoyment of the lower classes, people from the peasantry, lads who could have been very angry at the system. And that's why we see a lot of the violent themes that we see in the early ballads. And then when we get ahead to the later stories, that is when we see the narrative really begin to shift. That is when the Robin Hood character is changed from a low-born yeoman rebel to a high-born nobleman, a disinherited nobleman. This is when the Ser Robin of Loxley character makes his way into the legend. And of course, once he's been gentrified, that's when Maid Marian finds a way into the stories as well, because we can't have a lord without a lady. And it's in this particular era that the Robin Hood stories really do begin to get quite romanticised. And then when you skip even further ahead in time to the 19th and 20th centuries, the stories are being developed solely for the enjoyment of children. Now, whilst you've been watching this video, you may very well have noticed that the majority of the tropes and the themes, and even some of the characters that are synonymous with the Robin Hood legend in the modern world, are actually products of the later and more modern versions of the stories, and not the original stories, the early ballads. But I reckon it's important to recognise those early ballads, because without them there'd be no legend of Robin Hood. I mean, there'd probably be a legend of somebody, but it wouldn't be Robin Hood, because at the end of the day, without Robin Hood, yeah, there'd be no Robin Hood, okay? So, to summarise, I reckon it's fairly safe to say that we have more than established here today that the Robin Hood character hasn't always been the same person, and there were in fact several different versions of the character from the stories throughout the centuries. Now, all of this is important to consider when we're talking about the real history behind the legend, because I've said it before and I'll say it again, when it comes to identifying the real Robin Hood, it is simply impossible to single out just one individual, because, as we've learned, the Robin Hood character hasn't always been one single individual. So it makes sense that there were in fact several different men throughout the medieval period who inspired the various versions of the Robin Hood characters. And when we cross-reference the stories with historical record, we find out that that is very much the case. Well, my friends, I'm afraid that is all we've got time for. So I want to say a massive thank you to each and every one of you for coming to join me here in medieval England. But you best be on your way now. So smash that subscribe button to join my merry band of outlaws. Good night, God bless, and as always, Herne protect us.